Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the Merge Medical Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Brown, with my co-host, Dr. Jeff Cole. We're joined today by Frank Ahmann, CEO of Triflo. Triflo has developed a percutaneous, non-invasive tricuspid valve replacement. And this is important because tricuspid regurgitation affects millions of people worldwide annually, and it causes significant mortality and morbidity. And there just aren't really a lot of good options other than opening the patient up traditionally, which is a sternotomy. I am particularly interested in this device because I'm a cardiothoracic TEE trained anesthesiologist. And so I was particularly interested in this when I heard about it. Frank, as you know, I'm already an investor in this, and we're really excited to have Frank here with us. Frank, tell us about Triflo.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. As you indicate, Triflo is a company that has developed a completely novel approach for tricuspid valve repair. It's something that was done from the beginning, not trying to adapt technologies, designs for other valves such as the mitral valve, but in fact, the founders decided to get together and come up with a de novo design that really addresses the specific issues that are encountered in the right side of the heart and the tricuspid valve itself. A huge problem. We can get into the numbers, but there's, well over 5 million patients between the US and the EU that could benefit from this procedure. And there is very little that is being done to them to help them along other than, trying to manage palliative with drugs or eventually a surgery, which in these patients who have advanced stage is fairly difficult and has a significant risk factor attached to it. So the founders got together and decided to come up with a brand new design that addresses a much more significant, larger patient population, specifically for tricuspid regurgitation, with a couple of benefits. Number one, the valve is minimal in its design. It's basically a valve that works with the native valve. So it's not replacing the current valve. It's simply there to work in tandem with a native valve, regardless of how large or how small or what shape the native valve has, and the orifice that is leading to the regurgitation. So that's basically the beginnings of it. We can talk about the technology or talk a little bit more about the history of the company. It's up to you guys.
I have my father recently, within the last couple of months, had a procedure, percutaneous treatment for the mitral valve. What can you tell me about the market? Was that the first solution along this line? And if so, how many people are out there doing that? And then it sounds like you've mentioned for the tricuspid, what's the landscape?
Oh, yeah. Let me give you a quick overview of the landscape. So, the idea of moving into a minimally invasive solution for any cardiac valve, whether it's the aortic, the mitral on the left side of the heart, or in our case, the tricuspid and the right side of the heart, um, is pretty obvious, right? We want to replace open chest surgery, and
Yeah.
we now have the catheter, the technology to navigate into the area and to actually do all the necessary repairs, whether it is replacing the valve or it is just putting in a clip to, making the annulus a little bit narrower and thus closing that orifice that is causing the regurgitation. Originally, most of the work was on the left side of the heart, so with the aortic and the mitral valve, just like your father received. And there are several technologies out there driven by the large cardiovascular global companies that have been developing this in the past few years. Interestingly, for the tricuspid valve, people used to refer to it as sort of the forgotten valve. It is astounding in the sense that the incidence of tricuspid regurgitation, particularly as we age, is much larger in the tricuspid than it is in the mitral and in the aortic valve. So this is a significant problem, but it was forgotten for a couple of reasons, perhaps. Number one, there is no good solution. As we said before, you can use palliative control medication. You can use a surgical intervention, which is going to have significant risk. But also the diagnosis was a little bit slow. So when you are at the initial stages of tricuspid regurgitation, it's difficult for the doctor to actually know that that is what the problem is. They're seeing patients who have, fatigue, edema, and those kinds of problems. So usually it gets detected when it gets to be a real problem. And at that stage, again, the risk or the solutions that are available are not obvious, or they're less than satisfactory. And so, you know, in as the technologies developed for transcatheter valve repairs, there were the usual suspects, those large companies, as well as several startups that began to adapt what was working in the aortic or the mitral valve in terms of the valve design, and say, well, it's got to work. Let's try it in the tricuspid. Let's try it in the right side of the heart. However, the challenges in the right side of the heart and the tricuspid valve are significantly different. The shape of the tricuspid valve is very different. Just as an example, we initially think tricuspid, that means there's probably 3 leaflets in the valve. In fact, that's not necessarily the case, only in 54% of the patients. Many patients have 4 valves in the tricuspid, many have 2. So this is also the shape of it, the annulus, is not necessarily planar and straight shaped. There are influences in terms of the shape of the atrium and shape of the ventricle, and all of these things make it very, very challenging to adapt these other technologies, as I said before. And so this is where Triflo, where the founders started to play and come up with a completely different design that would be, addressing these specific indications or challenges.
I think those are good points you're making because I started the TAVR program at Baptist, and the aortic valve is pretty much just a check valve. And when we started to look at mitral, we weren't doing tricuspid, but there's a lot more to the other valves than just being a check valve. I'm particularly interested in the product itself. Can you describe that for us?
With regards to the design of the Triflo, there are really 2 components that are critical. Number one is the anchoring system, and number 2 is the actual valve, which we call the Triflo Flow Optimizer. So in terms of the design of the valve, we came up with 3 components that are critical. Obviously, there is a unique patented delivery system, which is, by the way, one size fits all. So if we decided to have a larger valve or a smaller valve, you don't need to have a separate, different size delivery system. So I'll leave that for a moment to come to the important parts, which are the anchoring system and the valve itself. So this is the implant portion, if you will, of the TriFlow device. As far as the overall fixation system or the anchoring system, this is very different in the sense that it only has 3 legs, if you will, that will fixate the device to the annulus shelf. Basically, this anchoring device, once in place, is going to hold the actual valve. And the valve is, think of it as a little umbrella, if you will, that is going to float and can be positioned by the physician to cover the orifice wherever that regurgitant orifice is. And when the heart goes into systolic pressure, it will actually lock and close as if you were opening the umbrella, right? And thus it will seal the orifice that's there while the native valve is also working. And then in diastole, when the flow starts going in the other direction, the flow optimizer, which is what we call that valve, actually, the umbrella, if you will, it'll collapse again to let the blood flow in. So again, the three components, number one, the delivery device, which is very critical. Number two, the fixation mechanism, which is minimalistic. It doesn't require any traumatic positioning. It basically just locks into the shelf of the annulus. And then number three, the actual valve, which is working together with the native valve. So what all of that leads to is that you can adapt the system to all kinds of shapes of the annulus as well as the valves themselves.
Hmm.
You can adapt it to the location where the orifice happens to be. And if you look at the design itself, it's minimal, right? The footprint of the device, particularly if you were to compare it to a replacement valve, is very minimal. And that means that you're also going to have less anticoagulation issues to deal with. Yeah, all of this leads to hopefully long-term superior clinical results.
That's great, Frank. I've got several technical questions. I'd like to stay on this topic for just a little bit if I can. It's delivered through the internal jugular or the femoral vein.
At this stage, it's a transfemoral. So we're doing femoral axis, but it could be another axis as well.
And if I'm understanding correctly, it's dynamic. You're not patching a hole. It opens and closes, as you said, with systole and diastole appropriately.
That's correct. So this and it doesn't entirely replace the native valve. It just works where the native valve is no longer closing appropriately and sealing that orifice.
And I know that the anticoagulation is always an issue. We don't want patients anticoagulated that don't need to be. Do we know, or do you know how much anticoagulation, if any, will be required for this device?
So at this stage, we don't have final formal recommendations. That's going to be part of the clinical trials as we move forward. So far, what we have done is not required any other anticoagulation than what the patients who we treated already had. So most of these patients are on some form of anticoagulation anyway because of their comorbidities or other issues that they may have. And so that's what we've continued to use. But again, this is to be developed over time.
And what gauge is the catheter? What French gauge is that's delivered through?
Yeah, so at the outside of the catheter, the delivery system is the 36 French steerable catheter on the outer, and on the inner, it's a 28 French.
Mm-hmm.
As a orthopedic surgeon, some of these concepts, they're just so foreign to me to trying to cross over from orthopedics to cardiology, forces and wear and tear and, local pressure. How does that not ulcerate tissue? I mean, it's amazing to me because in our world, the teaching is if in the skeleton anyway, if an internal implant gets stressed over and over again, eventually it fails. You tape a little pebble on the bottom of the foot and you walk
Mm-hmm.
on it enough, you get an ulcer. So how is that working? How is the fixation stable enough for it to be harmoniously present there in the heart and not migrate? And it's fascinating.
Yeah, you touch on a great point, which is really the fascinating anatomy and the function of the heart, right? In many ways, it's a wonder that heart valves that are implanted last so long. I mean, we now test these for millions and millions of cycles before we put them in humans, but the resilience of the system itself is very significant, has been developed over decades of practice, right? Um, as far as the fixation is concerned, again, the three legs, if you will, of the device, the anchors of the device, they will clip on, if you will, or they will just connect to the annular ring at the site of the commissures. So this is where the each of the valves gets in contact, but between the two valves where they
Mhm.
get in contact with the annulus. And once they're locked in there, you will also see in the design that these are the only parts of the entire device that have a fabric, little socks, if you will, those white socks. And over the course of a couple of weeks, that sock gets endothelialized. So the tissue actually begins to cover and integrate
Mm.
and thus fixate over the long term the device. And
Mm.
this has led, in our experience, both in the animals as well as the humans we've treated so far, has led to a very stable fixation. Given the blood flow and the pressure, there's also no issue that the system might kind of loosen up again. Once you clip them on, those are there to stay. And an important factor of this is also that um, the tricuspid valve tends to change in its shape and its size as the right ventricle changes in shape and size as well. And so the system that we have, the Triflo system, is able to adapt to that dynamic change of the right heart. And you can do that when you have this type of system where you've got those three anchors that are in a way mobile, if you will, together with the motion of the valve itself.
What can you tell us about your other co-founders?
Yeah, it's a great story. Initial thrust for this came from three individuals. One of them is a professor in Italy at the University of Rome, Gian Paul Lucia. He has been involved in several first-in-human procedures with regards to mitral valve and aortic valve. Is one really of the true pioneers of the transcatheter valve technologies. The other one is an engineer based here in the United States, Luca Pesci, who worked initially at Edwards Life Sciences, one of the leaders in heart valves, or the leader in heart valve in the industry. Then joined a company called CardiaQ, which was developing a mitral valve as well, and that company got acquired by Edwards. So he got plenty of experience from an engineering point of view in designing these devices. And then the third part of this is the chairman of the company, Stefan Piat, who had been at several companies, including Abbott Life Science and Abbott, and now is in Paris. And it was these three gentlemen that, in working together on a few of the other valve systems, they said there's got to be a better solution for the tricuspid valve. And that gave rise to what eventually became several patents, and then the design itself. And now, 5 years later, the first clinical cases.
That's awesome. I will tell you, Jeff, for those that aren't cardiac anesthesiologists, everybody has tricuspid regurgitation. Like it's almost like you look at it and it almost feels normal. So many people, by the time they get a CABG or they get another valve replaced, you see it. If we're doing something endoscopically, or percutaneously rather, there's nothing we could do about it. We just leave it alone. And there's significant morbidity even to replacing or repairing that, even when you're already open. So this is a huge thing for mankind. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong here, Frank. And you got a powerhouse team. It sounds like is there not one competitor to this product?
There are several competitors, obviously, with such a gigantic opportunity, as you mentioned before, millions of patients. I would say that the world, as typical for most of these cardiac devices, is divided into two groups. Number one are the global cardiovascular device companies, Edwards Life Sciences, Abbott, Medtronic, Boston Scientific.
Mm-hmm.
And then you encounter a large number of startup companies, including ours, that are developing new technologies. And obviously, a lot of people are participating in the space. There are essentially four approaches, competitively speaking. The most advanced and already on the market in Europe and also widely now used in the States is edge-to-edge repair. That is Abbott TriClip system. Edwards has its own system called Pascal. And this is a system that is applicable to a small percentage of the patients that have a rather small orifice and have a very specific size and shape of the annulus. But it is practical, and it is the most advanced system out there. The second technology is basically annuloplasty, where you're trying to repair the annulus and reshape the annulus. This is a technology that had 4 or 5 companies that have failed. So at this stage, it's questionable that that approach will work. And then we have replacement, where you are completely replacing the annulus, the valves, the entire system. There is one device, Edwards Evoke, that has recently shown good clinical results from reducing regurgitation, but there were also significant side effects and major adverse events, and again, potential for bleeding or for anticoagulation. But there are several companies out there. The last one are those that don't fit in the 3 groups that I told you before. So there are devices that are connecting to the vena cava, as an example. Questionable if that's going to work. But we are in that sort of group of others with an approach that is, however, very distinct from competitors.
When you said replacement, is that's an open replacement versus
It's
you, where you're adding to the current anatomy, not replacing it, but supplementing it?
Yeah, so it is done through a catheter, still minimally invasive, but essentially what you're doing is you are replacing the annulus and the valves with a completely de novo system. So it's a fairly large system, comparatively speaking, and it you know includes the advantage that you've got a brand new valve, and so you're going to indeed be able to reduce regurgitation to none. However, because you're putting in this rigid, large system comparatively, you're going to affect the size of the ventricle. You're going to have complications with regards to bleeding. And what's interesting in the data, which we haven't seen all the details, but one issue that we're really interested in is the measurement of what we call TAPSE, tricuspid annular plane systolic excursion. And that's basically the measure of performance, if you will, of the ventricle and of the valve itself. And so we don't see that the replacement device is actually changing that measure, that TAPSE measure, which is all critical. Whereas with our device, what we have seen in our patients is that it significantly improves that. So uh, again, that's a little bit about the replacement technology.
That's interesting. So you've seen improved TAPSE in the human subjects that have been done, and I guess you did this in a porcine model.
That's correct. So, you know, it's really fascinating to see in our cases, in particular in the human cases, that this is much more, and it is about much more than regurgitation. Um, there is also a question of what is the function of the right ventricle and the right atrium in these situations? Is that being improved, or are you just improving the regurgitation? We find that when you are improving the overall heart function, there is a significant improvement, and eventually this will be borne out by clinical data, but you'll find an improvement in how the patient feels, exercise capacity very significantly, quality of life, All of these things will come not just from reducing the regurgitation, but actually from improving the function of the ventricle itself. And that is one of the things that we can measure. TAPSE, we measure such things as volume of the right ventricle, blood volume inside,
Hmm.
which we have reduced in our patients. And so this bodes well for the long-term outcomes in terms of what it means for the patient, which
Hmm.
is feeling better and feeling more vital, and ultimately also what matters to the reimbursement agencies and the payers, which is fewer hospitalizations, and a better economic outlook as well from an expenditure point of view for these types of diseases.
Do they know, or do we know what is the mechanism that is allowing it to improve the right heart function? Is it the flow optimizer?
Yeah, so essentially what we believe is happening here is that by reducing the regurgitation, we are decreasing the tension that the right ventricle is under. And reducing the tension of the ventricle is a good thing. It allows for the muscle to operate more efficiently, if you will,
Hmm.
and for contract and expand more efficiently with less energy, and with a better, obviously output of blood. And this tension reduction is something that has been also discussed on the left side of the heart. And potentially what we have here is a benefit, again, beyond just looking at regurgitation, that speaks to improving somebody with, let's say, heart failure and preserved ejection fraction,
Hmm.
as well as tricuspid regurgitation. A little bit early for me to make those statements, but from what we've seen in the 4 patients we've treated so far, things are looking rather good.
That really makes me wonder if you couldn't take the same idea and put it in the mitral valve position.
Absolutely, you could, and the patents are available for that. We covered that application as well. There is no reason why this should not work in the mitral valve, and so obviously we are extremely focused right now on the tricuspid
Yeah.
indication, but in the future, this could be applicable to other valves as well.
Do you feel like you're well protected?
Absolutely. So the company at this stage has 5 issued patents that cover US, Europe, China, and there are several other patents in the works. I should also say that the patents cover not only the tricuspid valve design, as we have described it before, but also is applicable to adapting to the mitral valve if when the day comes that we have to do that. So everything is very well protected at this stage.
Frank, can you review stage of development? Where you've been, where you are now, and what are the milestones in front of you?
So basically, the whole development started just about 5 years ago from scratch. And the first 4 years were spent doing all of the design and significant amount of testing that can go before you're able to treat any humans. So there were plenty of acute and chronic studies with swine. As I've said before, evaluation over millions of cycles that you need to show that the valve is opening and closing correctly, that it doesn't loosen up, that there are no leaflets that potentially could fly off, et cetera, et cetera. This very, very significant amount of testing really goes back to decades of experience, and are well set by the FDA in terms of what's required. After these 4 years, we were able to move to a first in human clinical trial, which has taken place in Europe. And the 4 patients that we have treated were all procedural successful. And in particular, we're following now 3 patients who have had also up to 8 months, one of them, 5 months, the other one. And we just did one right before Christmas. So it's going to be hitting the first month of treatment. With that, very unusual success rate for a first in human trial, because remember, the patients that are in these trials are patients who have very significant risk, are not eligible for any other existing procedure. And so this is sort of the last recourse for them. So the result to really have, 4 out of 4 successful is remarkable. And with that, we are now gearing up to the next level, which is a couple of studies. One is going to be taking place in Europe, and one is going to be taking place in the United States. With regards to the one in the US, which is the critical pathway for regulatory approval, it's what we call an early feasibility study. So there will be about 20 patients, a single arm. You look again at confirming the procedural safety and success and clinical efficacy, and that then down the road allows you to move into a pivotal trial and eventually getting the product approved to go to the market. And so that's where we are right now, preparing that early feasibility study, and then one additional study in Europe that is going to give us a little bit more flexibility in terms of expanding patient populations and looking at eligibility. And it's got a little bit more flexibility in it.
I'm glad you brought up the point about how sick the first patients are in these things, because I think a lot of physicians don't even realize when we're doing these, it's the sickest of the sickest patients. And it speaks to how well your device is working, because basically those people are just a step away from death. And I know when we did the TAVRs, it was the same way. The initial studies where people, had to be deemed non-surgical by 2 different doctors, the severe pulmonary disease, COPD, et cetera. So it does speak to what you're doing and how important it is. And it's really impressive how well those first few patients are doing. Once you get past that compassionate care phase, what's the rollout look like, or do you know yet? What's the sales sort of plan?
So eventually, this is going to be another couple of years of clinical development. And what happens is that you can commercialize this product pretty early on, right? So you compare to other, devices, and certainly compared to drugs, there is a period where you treat the early feasibility study, you do 20 patients or so, and then you go into a pivotal study. The pivotal study is about 300 patients that are randomized in this case. Now, interestingly, there are a lot of patients, so you can do these clinical trials fairly quickly comparative to other indications, if you were looking at other heart failure trials. And then you are going to be able to start commercializing the product as long as you follow basically a registry based surveillance of the patients. So they all will continue to be involved in a clinical study, but it's going to be a registry type of study. And quite honestly, we don't anticipate that we will reach the level of finishing up a pivotal study and doing the commercialization, because typically what happens in this industry is that the large, 4 participants that I mentioned before, typically that they will eventually acquire the technology and do what they do best, which is marketing and
Commercialize. Yeah,
commercializing,
that's right.
right?
Yeah.
And that's not our forte.
Right. I could clearly see that happening.
As far as potential and sales channels, it sounds like US and Europe. It sounds like tricuspid, possibly moving to mitral valve. I mean, that sounds like huge potential. What kind of numbers have been looked at there, or is it even
Yes.
postulating?
Yeah. So um, we can obviously speak that to the fact that this is a multi-billion-dollar opportunity from a revenue point of view. You mentioned US, you mentioned Europe. I should also mention China. There is also significant interest now in India, and we've even talked to a few folks in South America. So globally, the tricuspid regurgitation indication probably spans 70 million patients, 70 million patients. 5 of them are in the US and the EU alone. Um, the revenue potential for this, remains to be decided how this is going to be priced, but it easily goes into the 12 to 15 billion dollar annually in terms of potential. And then the question is, how fast can you penetrate out of that, right? It's not like you're going to be treating 100% of the patients on the first year. So for us in the cardiovascular device business, the question is always, how soon or how fast can you penetrate the marketplace. And for that, I have to pitch in, again, another feature that perhaps we didn't talk about a lot, which is the ease of implantation for the practitioner. So the interventional cardiologist or the cardiac surgeon that's doing this is a pretty straightforward procedure for them to follow. And we haven't encountered any issues there as far as them needing to learn any new techniques. This is all using the technologies that they're all using for imaging and otherwise. And so we believe that the uptake of the technology should also be pretty fast.
Can you compare and contrast that to the other product that you mentioned? We won't say a company's name, but the larger full replacement that you said is a much larger device, price wise, and then just technically.
Essentially, what they see is that their patient selection needs to be very careful. They need to make sure that the patients they're going to treat are going to have a profile that coagulation-wise, hemodynamics-wise is amenable. And so that probably means that the percentage of patients they're going to be treating is significantly smaller than ours. In terms of the practical procedure, the implant is straightforward. But again, you've got a significant potential disturbance of the right ventricle. We haven't addressed the peculiarities of the right ventricle, but you have chordae there that actually that sustain the valve. You have leads for pacemakers that many of these patients have. And these devices actually have a disturbance on all of those things. And so again, from a procedural point of view, that makes it much more complex. But at the end, I think that the device will be fine. It'll be fine just for a very small percentage of patients, maybe in the single digits, in comparison to what we have to offer, which, we expect to be applicable to, 70-80% of the patients that present with tricuspid regurgitation.
And I think the device sounds like it's simpler, therefore easier to manufacture.
That is very astute observation. So yes, from a manufacturing point of view, the fact that it's such a minimalistic design makes it also very amenable in terms of the economics of it. So profit margin wise, we would expect that to be a significant advantage.
I did the TAVR program at Baptist East here in Memphis for about 8 years. And once we got it down and we were really doing like normal patients, it was so significantly better than open procedures. It's just mind-boggling. We were actually doing them under sedation by the time I left there. So, I mean, we're almost at a point where we're doing valve replacement same day. Like these people could just about go home, as opposed to, so for anybody that's listening, I mean, you're talking about a sternotomy. This is for a non-medical person. This is opening your chest up. I mean, you're going to be in the hospital for a week at best, as opposed to any kind of percutaneous technology, which you're bringing to the table with this. So anybody that's listening, I mean, this is huge. And this sounds like a significant improvement on existing technology. And I'm excited to hear about the hemodynamic remodeling that's taking place, because you just think of these things as an on and off switch, and they're not, right?
Absolutely. Everything is in tandem, right? So the function of the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, the amount of blood that is ejected out of the heart, all of this is not a function of one valve or of 3 valves or 4 valves. It's actually also how the muscle works. And so we need to really understand the global functioning and look at the improvement of the global function of the heart. And this is where I think TAPSE and these other measures are very critical. And, if you look at TAPSE in particular, 14 millimeters or so usually is correlated with very poor prognosis. But as soon as you are north of 17 millimeters, if you go to 18, 20, 22, that's an indication of good long-term success. And that's what we're seeing with these patients, right?
That's
I would think
fantastic.
the comparison just cost between that open procedure and length of hospitalization and associated morbidity and mortality, I would think it's staggering to think how that's going to compare once you have a mature percutaneous program out running.
There are, significant costs for these patients as the present status is for them. It's not just the operation, which most of the cases, an operation cannot take place because there is too much risk involved. And so what you have here is frequent rehospitalization episodes, and that is expensive, particularly if somebody has an additional problem like heart failure and hypertension as an example. And so the ability to really affect the function, not just of the tricuspid valve, but of the entire heart, now means that you potentially look at reduced hospitalization rates. And so, you may be saving uh, tens of thousands of dollars for each hospitalization that you're sparing.
So it's not only a recurring revenue stream if it's commercialized successfully, but it's a growing revenue stream. And you're even talking about adding mitral valve, which would, in my mind, that would double your math.
Absolutely. So the potential here is as large as it gets for any of these medical device technologies, and that's the attractiveness of heart disease, right? It continues to be a driver of significant expenditures and growth, and no matter what you look at, uh, cardiac failure, cardiac diseases, regurgitation are going to be drivers of growth and expenditures for decades to come.
And I think that's a natural segue into the finances of this. We've talked about the addressable market. We all know is huge. It would help a lot of people. But are you guys in a funding round? Are you going to be soon? If so, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. The company has been historically financed with approximately $15 million that came in two rounds, the seed round and the Series A. And the Series A had as a goal to finish the first in human studies that we have now, brought to a conclusion. And so with that, we now have to gear up to take the company to a next level. And the next level is the ability to execute as flawlessly as possible the larger clinical trials. And that requires a slightly different group of people, a slightly expanded team. And for that purpose, and to complete the next clinical studies, we're looking at raising up to $25 million in a Series B round of equity. Yeah, we are open and in discussions right now with a couple of venture capital firms. But we may also make available the opportunity through some convertible notes for our current investors and other new investors who want to come aboard to expedite the financing and participate in the financing.
What will the post-money valuation be with this Series B round?
So I can tell you what the previous valuation was of the company, and that was $37.2 million. So this is the post-money Series A valuation.
Mm-hmm.
The B valuation remains to be determined when we have a lead investor who we don't presently have. So that's what we're looking for. But I would expect it to be obviously a plus from there. But we have to see what the market bears. Ultimately, the investors are going to be determining that together with us and negotiate that with us. At this stage, we don't have a valuation for the Series B.
So and Frank, you can correct me if I'm saying any of this wrong, but Triflo has a one-size-fits-all device that improves both systolic, diastolic function by reducing tricuspid regurgitation with an easily placed percutaneous procedure, similar to the well-known TAVR that the medical community is already aware of, eliminating the need for palliative care or an invasive procedure such as sternotomy.
Absolutely. Nicely put.
Hey, Frank, I just want to thank you for joining us here today. This has been a fascinating conversation. for me personally, and I know that the listeners will find it fascinating as well. We strive to have guests whose products and or services check mark several boxes. One, number one, they have to help patients, and number two, they have to help physicians do their jobs and make their jobs easier. And number three, have to at least have the potential for financial improvement in the lives of the Merge Medical members. And you definitely checkmark that box. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the Merge Medical podcast. Thank you, Frank, from the CEO of Triflo. And we're out.